So I want to just introduce you quickly to Dave Tonge. Dave and I have worked together on a bunch of open banking stuff, so I'm really glad he's here. Dave is the CTO of MoneyHub, developing an intelligent financial data and payments platform. He is involved in standards work across the OpenID Foundation, IETF ISO, and the Open Banking UK, with a particular interest in security profiles and decoupled authorization flows. He's co-chair of the Financial API Working Group, which we talked about a bit earlier, at the OpenID Foundation. So take it away, Dave.
Hi, yeah, it's good to be here. So yeah, thanks Pam for the intro. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about SIBO, just very quickly, little slides about some of the things we do. Very happy to talk about any of these afterwards, especially FAPI working group. If you are interested at all in standards, especially using kind of some of these open standards in the financial services space, please come and speak to me afterwards, because we're looking to get more people involved. So CIBA, unfortunately there will be some acronyms in this talk. Some of them will be TLAs, 3-letter acronyms, some of them will be longer. I will do my best to not go too acronym heavy, but CIBA stands for Client Initiated Back-Channel Authentication, which is a little bit of a mouthful, but let's just jump straight into some of the things that, that we can use it for. So the title of this talk was Pay with Your Phone. But CIBA actually doesn't really say anything about phones at all. So it could be pay with your watch. Could be pay with your smart glasses. Could be pay with your voice. Essentially, what we're talking about is decoupling the device on which you authenticate and authorize something and the device on which you can you grant access to and you consume a service on. And it's that fundamental decoupling that CIBA enables. So just a very quick bit of history, a little bit about the spec and potentially some of where I got involved in it. So in Europe, and yeah, I'm from the UK, and UK is still part of Europe and is still part of the EU. Fingers crossed for a bit longer. But there's a law which called PSD2, so the EU's second Payment Services Directive. And essentially what it mandates is for financial institutions, account providers, to provide API access for authorized third parties to interact with them, so that users can consent and grant access to their account data, also all consent to make payments via these third parties. And it's one of these laws, and we I think struggle with this in this sort of standard space of at a legal level, they don't want to go into too much technical detail, and that's right. But you have this weird intersection where essentially we have large private entities who are being regulated and forced to provide API access. And this was something, especially in Europe, the regulators were struggling with a bit. So there are a few different there are a few technical details, but one of the things that one of the working groups around this sort of settled on was essentially 3 high-level interaction flows between these 3 parties. So you've got your end user, and that could be a personal user or someone representing a business. You've then got the account provider, or in what we would maybe call the identity provider, the authorization server, and then you have the client or the relying party. And so the 3 sort of interaction flows between these users are redirect, embedded, and decoupled. So redirect is what we use in standard OAuth. It's been used in SAML. It's kind of what we know, and it works well for redirecting users. But really, the fundamental issue with it is you have to be on the same device. It could be on a smartphone, and smartphone, website to app to website. It could be on a laptop or a PC, but essentially it's on the same device. They define something called embedded, which is really just legalized phishing. This is what we're trying to move away from as the industry. This is sharing credentials, and okay, let me enter my banking credentials directly at a third-party site. But this is a reality that unfortunately this is still happening a lot today. So that is a interaction flow, but it's not one that many or any security professionals would endorse. And then there's decoupled, which is actually can provide some really nice user experience, but there's been a real sort of lack of standards in this area, really. So why is decoupled, why is it a good thing to look at? And not just in banking and finance, but if you think about all of the times you've had to identify yourself on a phone call, and you've had to give some random attributes that probably anyone with 5 minutes of Googling could try and find out for you, and where do you live, your date of birth, all of these things, and you've had to do that to somehow verify your identity on the phone. And actually, that is really not a great way of doing things. It's clunky, and it doesn't provide us with that high level of assertion at all. With something like CIBA, we could decouple those flows, and actually that call center agent could start a decoupled flow. I could get a notification to my smartphone. I could authorize, and authenticate using biometrics, and authorize, yeah, I'm going to grant this call center agent access to verify my identity, or potentially access to view parts of my account. And so that's a really nice example of where actually decoupled flow would be a lot better than a lot of the existing practice. But talking about the smartphone, many of us, or a watch, many of us have quite strongly authenticated sessions on these phones. Often we've had to, when we first registered and onboarded with our identity provider, per device keys have been set up, they're locked with biometrics. It really is quite a strongly authenticated session that we have on these devices. And yet, when we want to interact on other devices or in other areas, often we can't use that session. And so we're having to then re-log in back on a website and go through all this flow and maybe get a one-time code or have some pop up in an app. But what happens if we could bypass all of that, and actually I can just use this strongly authenticated session on this phone to authorize another device somewhere else? And payments is a good example of that. So let's get a little bit then into the detail of this. So Moderna, so the OpenID Foundation, I'm sure you've heard of, it's got a number of different working groups, and Bjorn is here, he's a chairman of Moderna. It's a working group really working with the mobile network operators, and we heard some of the work earlier that T-Mobile are doing. There's kind of quite a lot of mobile network operators internationally working in that group. And that's actually where the initial CIBA spec came from. And they were really trying to solve this problem for mobile network operators. And so they were developing the spec there, and it was kind of sitting there, and some people were thinking about implementing it. But then in financial services, we had PSD2, and we had a look around the standard space at what existed to solve this decoupled problem. We looked at device flow, and it does work, but it's really aimed at that as the name says on the tin, on these devices. It's authorizing your smart TV and your set-top box and that type of thing. That's really what it's aimed at. But yeah, Moderna had the CIBA spec. So what is the client-initiated back-channel authentication flow? So I could take you through very basic flow. So on the back channel, the third party says to the bank, and this could be, again, I'm using an example in finance, that, okay, I have.
What do you mean by back channel?
Thanks, Mike. So, so yeah, on a standard OAuth flow, essentially the first interaction takes place on the front channel. Where actually I've got a user, and I'm saying, okay, I'm going to send this user through to the authorization server at the IDP. And I'm going to send them all through on the front channel with the client ID, so that's in a browser redirect most of the time. Whereas in the back channel, we've got two servers communicating with each other just on the back end without any user interaction at all. So it means you can send a lot more information. So there's a server-to-server call on the back channel, the third party to the bank. I've got this user, and actually I have an identifier for this user, 123, and they want to make a payment. Then, and again, this is a simplified flow. I'll go into a bit more detail in a minute. The bank can recognize user 123. We'll get into the details of that. And so the bank then calls out to user 123, maybe a push notification to the phone, authenticates them and asks, do you want to make this payment? The user says yes. Insert your fully GDPR compliant consent flow there. And then back on the back channel, the bank says to the third party, here's a token that allows you to make that payment or access those resources. So that's at a very, very high level. You can see it's actually conceptually, it's a lot simpler flow. I've got the first call on the back channel is just saying, look, this is the transaction, the authorization that I want to make. and it's for this user, and that's key, because this is different from redirect flows. The bank or the IDP then deals on the front channel with how do I contact that user, how do I gain their consent, how do I authenticate them. They do all of that on the front channel, and then on the back channel again, here's your token, do your stuff. So in some ways, conceptually, it's a lot simpler. So if we just move through. So just in a little bit more detail, and I'll brush over this. Please, I'm happy to go into more detail separately, or answer any questions via email. So the key things here is that we're sending some sort of hint about the user, and that's the main difference really compared to your standard redirect flows. And a standard redirect flow, the client, the relying party, doesn't need to know anything about the user. There's some user, and they just send them to the IDP and says, OK, identify them, authenticate them, and gain their consent. Whereas here, because we're sort of separating out these two channels, the relying party needs to know something about the user. And at first, you might say, oh, this is going to cause a lot of privacy issues. But there are so many scenarios where actually the relying party does know the identity of the user. So it's quite rare that you have a situation where really you want absolutely zero correlation, and you want the complete anonymity between the user at the relying party and the user at the identity provider. There are some scenarios, but there are many where that doesn't exist. So there's some standard things which go there. We can talk about the binding message later. But essentially, the OP responds with to the OpenID provider. Sorry, I told you there'd be some acronyms here. OpenID provider, authorization server, whatever we want to call it, returns with some identifier for this session. Again, the OP then gains that consent. There's this optional binding message. And at the end, the relying party is then just polling that endpoint. So that's just a little bit of an overview of the spec, but I want to dive into some of the main issues with this, really. And so the first one, really, is that we've got these two different devices. And so the spec defines we've got a consumption device and an authentication device. So the authentication device, and again, it does not have to be a phone. CIBA doesn't really mention phones anywhere. But it's a common use case. My authentication device may be my smartphone, but it could be anything. And the consumption device, it could be a laptop. It could be a point-of-sale terminal. It could be I'm interacting with my Alexa device. There's all sorts of different devices it could be. The point is, it could be anything. Got a little diagram, and this is produced by the team at Open Banking, who are in the UK, who are looking at using this. And so this is an example, and again, I apologize, it's a little bit small, but just really showing that I could be on a website wanting to make a payment, and I enter, some identifier. Again, that's left a little bit in the dark as to what that is, and I get a notification to my app, authorize a payment, and then it all goes through. And so, in some ways, some of this is shortcutting some of the stuff that happens already, where you have all the 3D secure, and in Europe now we have strong customer authentication. So already at the moment, you're having to enter details in the browser, and then get some notification to your phone, and then enter it in. So this is almost shortcutting some of that and say, look, let's just set it up as a decoupled flow right from the beginning. This is another example in practice. But because, so let's again, there's many examples where there is an ongoing relationship between these three parties. In fact, many scenarios. So the client and the authorization server and the end user, it's not just a one-time relationship. There's an ongoing relationship. And so potentially I've authorized, I've got for this user before, I've got an ID token through any flow. It might be through a redirect flow that I got an ID token. I could just use that as an ID token hint to start a SIBA flow. So it can piggyback on, after existing flows. It's just a profile of OAuth. It plays well with existing, OAuth and OpenID Connect flows. So let's just dive in a little bit into some of the issues, though. What about privacy? Isn't this a step backwards? So as I said, there are many scenarios where it's actually fine to share identifiers. But actually, there is quite a lot of nuance in how we have what sort of identifier to use. So one option is discovery, and this can work quite well in the mobile network space, where I've got a user and I can send it to some discovery service, and they can work out maybe by the IP of the network they're on or some other sim applet and work out what the user is, and I get back some sort of token, and I can use that as a login hint token, and so that can work quite well, and that kind of preserves some of the privacy aspects that we like. It could be a static identifier, so it could just be an email address. It could be whatever login ID I use for a bank or an identity provider. And obviously this is open to abuse, because if, for example, I can trigger a payment consent flow just by knowing your email address, then I could just, let me just start a few flows out, and maybe by mistake you'll authorize one of them, or your kid has your phone at that time, and I'll just click yes. And so there is issue with static identifiers. We do have in the spec the option of a spam prevention code. So especially for people who are implementing it using static identifiers, they can set up some sort of spam prevention code. So it's not just a static identifier, but this code also needs to be sent in the CIBA request. But then there are other options. And so this is what we're looking at using in open banking, is a dynamic single-use identifier. So the idea here is that actually on my banking app, I go to a screen and I generate an identifier, and then I scan that at a point of sale terminal. So actually it keeps this, these privacy aspects, because actually all the Reliant party knows is it's got some token that represents some user, but the bank knows exactly who the user is. Again, we talked about the previously issued ID token, but there are lots of other ways. So when people hear about flows like CIBA, often they immediately think about the static identifier, and isn't this bad, and just using an email address or a phone number to start a flow. But actually there are a lot of different options in terms of which identifier to use. Another problem, I know we sometimes talk about session binding, or people talk about session fixation attacks, or things around this this area. But essentially, it's how do I know these two devices are together? How do I know I'm authenticating and authorizing access to the correct consumption device? And this is a problem which we don't really have in redirect. Because in redirect, we send these various parameters through, and we get various parameters back, and we have hashes of them, and we can use Pixie, and we can use all sorts of things to make sure we can kind of bind that we know when we send the user here, and then we get them back, that it's the same session. So there's lots of mechanisms we have in the redirect flow to support that. But obviously in CIBA, we literally don't know, because these two devices are separate. So again, that's this use of a dynamic single-use identifier kind of does the binding, because I generate it on this device and then I scan it here, and that essentially can bind the sessions together. You can just let the user decide. So let's say the example of payments. Again, this is putting a little bit of burden on the user, but if the user is authorizing a payment for $10 at a coffee shop. Well, they are there in that coffee shop expecting that notification to come through for $10. They have enough context to know that, yeah, this is a valid request. And so you can sort of leave it up to the user if there is enough context. There is option in the spec of a binding message. So you can have a binding message which is displayed on the consumption device, and then either entered or displayed on the authentication device. So I can be at a point of sale terminal. I somehow identify myself, and it displays some code, ABC123, and then when I get the push notification to my phone, it also shows ABC123, and I can kind of do it that way. So there's a few different ways in which the spec allows the sessions to be bound together. Poll, ping, and push. So the spec has been through quite a bit of iteration, really, since it sort of started off in the Moderna working group. And one of the things that we were looking at is, okay, I glossed over at the beginning, was, well, how do we get the tokens, access token, maybe ID token, back to the client? So obviously polling is one mechanism, where you could just keep polling the endpoint, and actually that could work with long polling as well. So it doesn't need to be just continuous short polling. It could be long polling and leave that connection open. However, the original CIBA spec had the idea of notifying, and actually the tokens could be pushed back to the client. And so we kept that in there, but we also added a mode called ping. And the naming of this was actually from John Bradley, but it was after he'd left ping. So there's no sort of promotion of ping with this, but it just kind of made sense and was a bit of alliteration. So we got these 3 different token delivery modes: poll, ping, and push. So poll is where you're just polling the token endpoint. Is it ready? Is it done? Has the user authenticated? Ping is when the authorization server, when it's done, it just sends like a webhook, but just with an ID, just with the authorec ID saying, yeah, hey, I'm done. Now you can come to the token endpoint and get the tokens. And so that's quite nice because you get some of the UX benefits of you get that instant notification when the tokens are ready, and you're not having to poll, but it keeps the security characteristics of getting the tokens from the token endpoint. Or you can push, which is literally the tokens get pushed to the client. And we've sort of disallowed that for the financial APIs, just because the security properties around it is very different from your traditional OAuth setups. But in the mobile network space, they really wanted to keep it in because some of these flows will be used in very high latency situations where they want to reduce the number of round trips as much as possible. So yeah, that's these 3 different modes: poll, ping, and push. And so it's pretty flexible, really, as to kind of how you want to implement it. So just kind of in conclusion, then we can take some questions, really. From my perspective, I think CIBA really does solve a problem. There wasn't really anything existing out there which was sorting this. Yes, you could kind of use UMA to do some of this. You could try and use a device flow to try and meet some of these use cases, but actually there wasn't anything that really properly solved this problem. And so it's really exciting that the industry's kind of come together, and we've managed to get CIBA to a place now where there's the implementers draft in the Moderna group. We're about to go to implementers draft status for the FAPI profile, which is just a small profile on top. And quite a few vendors have started implementing it. So I know definitely of Authleet have implemented it, and I know Ping have implemented it. So it's starting to be available for people to really start playing around with. And yes, some of the pushback and a lot of discussions with John Bradley about this. It will never be quite as secure as a redirect flow. But that's OK, because it's often many times more secure than existing practices. So as long as we understand the trade-offs and the risks, and what I suppose we don't want to do as an industry is something like the implicit, where you said, oh, if something's there, people are just going to use it, even when potentially they should be doing a more secure option. So where redirect makes sense, it's best still to keep with redirect. This isn't instead of redirect. But for cases where actually you want to do a more decoupled interaction, then CIBA works really well. So I'm hoping as well that we enter the day where we stop having to identify ourselves with some sort of attributes over the phone. And actually, I could just get a push notification to my phone, and yeah, I authorize that call center agent to know who I am. I authorize them to see access, to see details of my account. And so I think that's a good place to move to. So yeah, any questions?
What's the prospect for uptake with actual payment providers and banks?
You want to repeat the question?
So the question is, what's the prospect for uptake with actual payment providers? So it's not being mandated in the UK. It's kind of an optional, but they have defined it. There is a bit of nuance to that. There is an argument that some of the banks will be forced to implement it because, so let's say, for example, a provider who only has a mobile banking app, but people want to use them to pay for things like at a website. At the moment, some of them implement a bit of a strange kind of redirect flow where they do their own decoupled experience. So yeah, it's not mandated, but I think there's a pretty good likelihood that a few of them will implement it.
Probably a silly question. How do you contrast the redirect flow with the decoupled flow? And the second question is, in the previous talk, there was a mention, in one of the previous talks, there was a mention about CIBA's applicability for a passwordless authentication. So could you touch upon that as well? Yeah,
I mean, the nice thing is, because you're, Because you give complete control to the authorization server on exactly how it wants to authorize, it can choose exactly how it wants. I mean, it could choose that actually, I don't even need to ask the user this time. You know, let's just let it go straight through. But it could be, again, because you've got your strongly authenticated session, could be some sort of push notification. I just used Touch ID. You know, it could be some FIDO thing. It can be anything. And that's a nice thing. The spec is very agnostic as to how it's done. It's just talking about the interaction flows between them. And yes, some of this can happen on redirect, but redirect, your problem is that you're limited on the device. And if you want to jump to another device, you're doing something proprietary. That's kind of outside of the specs, whereas with CIBA, it's like right baked into the specs. We're going to, at a first-class level, support this idea of these two different types of devices.
So is there a spec that governs the CIBA flow?
Yeah, so it's available just on the OpenID Foundation website. If you go to the Moderna working group, you'll see the main core profile there. And then we have a profile of it on the FAPI working group. So all at OpenID Foundation. And it's there. Yeah, and there's the working group. There's public issue trackers. So if you do have any questions or want to get more involved, then yeah, please do let us know.
Okay. And a last question, I think.
So specific to payments, does CIBA do any transactional binding too, like for the name of the merchant and the payment?
No. So okay, it's a very good question. The short answer is that, and maybe just especially the context. So in the UK, in how open banking has been delivered over there, we have a separate endpoint where you send all of that data in terms of the payee, the amount, any other reference, and you get back some ID, some intent ID we call it. And at the moment in the redirect flows, that's being put in well, in some places it's being put in a claims object. Other people are putting it in scope. In CIBA, you could again do either. You could put it in scope. You could send it as an additional parameter. And so we're kind of offering these as different options. What we're saying you shouldn't do, which some people are thinking of doing, is trying to put it into this login hints token. So we're saying the login hints, that should just be for identifying the user. And actually, there's all these other places. Because it's on the back channel, it's server to server, there's so many different options for where you can put that extra metadata. OK, thank you.